Hey guys, this is Pastor Zac. Thank you so much for joining us for another edition of Porch Talk. Thank you for being here with us today. Super excited about a guest that we get to have with us today. This is Mr. Jeff Phillips. He is a pastor, church planner extraordinaire. God has used him in some great areas, and he is my former youth minister. And so when I was a 10th grader, came to Gardendale's First Baptist Church, got connected in the student ministry there. Jeff was our student minister. He allowed me to be able to intern with him. I remember those days. And Jeff, the Lord used you in a great way in my life, man. So thankful for you. It's been so great getting to reconnect with you the last couple of days.
Yeah, man. Yeah, loved it.
So Jeff came in. If you're listening to this, if you're not a member of Enid Baptist Church, he came in, was actually one of our speakers for a 4-day revival we had here at Enid Baptist Church just in the last few days. The Lord really used him in a great way to kind of wrap that up for us on Wednesday night. And so while he was in town, before he flies back, he is pastoring right now Hope Church in Henderson, which is a suburb of Las Vegas.
Yep.
And you're going to get to hear more about that in a few moments. But he was able to fly down, and before he got out of town, I wanted to be able to do a podcast with him, have him as a guest with us, to talk about some things that, honestly, we don't really talk about a lot in church world. And so really the topic of our podcast today is really just to talk about the highs and lows of ministry, of serving the Lord. I was thinking about, 2 Corinthians chapter 6 before we really started this today, was thinking about how the Apostle Paul talked about the overall trajectory of his ministry. And we would obviously say that he has the most successful ministry in the New Testament as far as long term, as far as a missionary. The Lord used him to plant churches all over the modern world at that point. But it wasn't always easy. He didn't just come into a place and start preaching the gospel. He wasn't leading, and thousands of people get saved. He wasn't leading Billy Graham crusades, and it was hard. It was difficult.
Yeah.
He was stoned, and he was beaten multiple times. I mean, it was a very, very difficult ministry, and that's why he said to Timothy that he had fought a good fight. He had finished the race because he had ran hard.
Yeah.
And so, Jeff, you and I have kept in touch with each other for years, and y'all have, and I could not respect you and Sarah and y'all's kids, Emma and Ty, more, because you have been in great, successful seasons of ministry where honestly it would have been easy to just kind of settle in and ride it out. But the Lord called you guys to some of the difficult areas to really put your yes on the table, to do some difficult things for the Lord, and really had to endure some of those seasons. And so it seems like a lot of times in church world, when we talk about ministry, especially missions, church planting, we always want to tell the huge success stories, which is awesome, and praise the Lord for that. But we don't always want to talk about the trials and the struggles, and even some of those stories that from a world standard would not say, well, that's a success story. And what I would challenge even our listeners to know, that everywhere the gospel is preached, that people are told about Jesus, it is a success story in the eyes of God. It is our responsibility is to sow the seed.
Right.
And the Lord is the one who brings the harvest. The Lord is the one who ultimately is watering that seed. But I would love for you to kind of walk us and tell our listeners a little bit about y'all's story prior to going to be a church planner in one of the most difficult areas in North America, and before and after, how God's cared for y'all on the flip side of that, but also what that season looked like. Yeah. So, hey, man, however you'd like to start that story.
No, it's awesome, man. Yeah. For us, growing up in Texas, surrendered to ministry in Texas, when you're it was the Dallas-Fort Worth area, we're a part of, I was a part of a small church right out of the gate, but then quickly went to a mega church and was a middle school pastor and high school pastor there.
Is that Fielder Road?
Yeah, Fielder Road.
Yeah, great church.
Yeah, in Arlington, Texas. And so was there during my seminary years for 3 years. And and loved it. It was great, and it was successful. And then God called us, connected us to Pastor Steve Gaines, and God called us out to First Baptist Gardendale, and God it was just a unique season for First Baptist Gardendale, honestly. But we just kind of happened to jump in the middle of all kinds of amazing things that the Spirit was doing and leading.
Yeah, which again, I'm a product of that.
Right.
And
yeah.
so, the fact that you guys put your yes on the table to move from Texas
Right.
to come be missionaries in Alabama.
Right,
So,
exactly.
My family benefited hugely from that. Myself, my brother. And so, again, I could not hold you and Sarah in higher regard for the way the Lord worked in you guys' life and through to us and to me.
Amen. Yeah, and it was just, we're 25 years old. We didn't know what we were doing. But we moved out, and just God was all over it, and that's when we realized, man, when you put your yes on the table, because I don't know what the stat is, something like 50-something% of Americans, especially those in the Southeast, live within 10 miles of where they were born.
Yeah.
And that's awesome. There's a lot of deep rootedness. There's a lot of great things that can happen because of that. And I'm not trying to knock that at all, but we're the other side of that percentage.
Yeah.
And, moving a 12-hour drive away from where we grew up and our parents and extended family, it was hard, and we were married 2 years, no kids. So it was like, I do tell in premarital counseling even, I was like, hey, if you really want to get to know somebody, move away from your family 12-hour drive away and just be look at each other and go, what are we going to do this weekend? Yeah. We have no extended family. We're not going to our parents' house, you know? And so, but it really did unite our hearts in marriage. And it was an incredible season for us. We have both of our kids here in Birmingham. And so it was amazing just to see what God was doing. And then, I have a mutual friend with David Jett, and David went to a church outside of Memphis. And about a year later, we felt like God was calling us to that church. And so, our families were ecstatic about that because it was about a 9-hour drive from Dallas.
We're getting closer.
Getting closer. And so went there, and it was amazing. And God taught us a lot. There were some definitely hard seasons there. And when David left to go down to Jackson, Mississippi, he asked us to go, and we said yes without even praying about it. And we went down there, and God was like, nope. And now we were like, oh, well, now what? We're at a church that, we went, we were called there, but at the same time we were called there to work with David, and now David's gone. We were in a little bit of a limbo, and we're just like, God, what do you want to do? And really, and he just through a series of events, through Passion conferences and different things like that, we were able to volunteer at Passion in Vancouver, British Columbia. And it was that conference that we were sitting in downtown Vancouver, floor-to-ceiling windows at a restaurant, and I was looking at all these tall buildings, and I saw a glow of TV lights in the tall buildings, and I was like, people live in these buildings? Because everywhere I've ever lived, the tall buildings were offices.
Businesses,
And my friend was like, yeah, there are people, they live all in these buildings. And 70% of the tall buildings in Vancouver were residential. And so you had all these people living downtown. And I asked my friend, I said, where do these people go to church? And he was like, man, I don't think these people go to church anywhere. And I was like, man, that's crazy. And so we finished up the conference, and we came back to Memphis, and I was laying in my bed one night, and all I could see in my mind's eye was the glow of TV lights in the tall buildings, and my friend's voice on repeat saying, I don't think these people go to church anywhere. I don't think these people go to church anywhere. I don't think these people go to church anywhere. And God saying, I want you to go start a church where these people can go. Yeah. And I was like, no. Yeah. I'm not moving to Canada, that's crazy. In fact, when our friends asked us to serve with Passion in Vancouver, I had to Google, where is Vancouver in Canada? I didn't even know what side of the country it was on. And then once we realized it was 3 hours north of Seattle, it was way on the West Coast, and we were there. And it's the most beautiful city we've ever been in, but to live there and to start a church there, that's not happening.
Which is and again, just for listeners, and all glory to the Lord, and we understand that. But just to really kind of set the stage here of what success in ministry looked like prior to this. So again, I remember seasons at Gardendale where investing in the next generation, student ministry, where we're talking hundreds of teenagers, go that go in years where there's dozens of teenagers who are giving their life to Christ, a student ministry staff of multiple full-time student ministry people that you're leading. I mean, as far as reaching the next generation, it's the pinnacle of success.
Yeah.
And then you had opportunities even during that season, even going to Memphis, to go to even bigger churches. I won't say the names of some of those, but you had opportunities to go. People were saying, yes, man, Jeff and Sarah, God is using y'all. Come to our church of 4,000 or 5,000 people, do student ministry, reach the next generation. And that would have been so easy and so tempting to say, man, that's easy. Stay in a southeast area, more of a Bible Belt area, do ministry, lead people to the Lord, and just kind of be safe.
Right.
But you guys are in that setting, and the Lord's calling you to what's not safe, what's unfamiliar, what's more difficult.
Right.
And if I remember, tell the story about, I think, when y'all started, so God starts birthing this heart for Vancouver. Y'all start investigating church planting.
Yeah.
You start connecting with North American Mission Board. And I remember you asked about where is the most difficult place to plant a church, and then what they said and how that worked.
Yeah, so we went up there and just kind of did like a site trip, and just felt like God was calling us, and so I went up there, talked to Ray Woodard, who was the director of church planting at the time in Vancouver, and so Ray was like, I said, hey man, like, where do we need to go? What does this look like? And he was like, he said, Vancouver is a difficult place. And he said, and we've been praying for years that somebody would go into downtown Vancouver and try to start something. And Sarah and I really felt like that's where God was leading us anyway. And he said, but it's transient. It's the most difficult thing. That's why no one goes in there.
Yeah,
and,
if I remember the words I think you said was like, difficult in church planting in Seattle.
Yes. And that was another guy. So Gary Irby, the director of church planting in Seattle, I met him within the first couple months of being there, and he goes, hey man, I'm so excited you're there in Vancouver. He said when people ask me about church planting in Seattle and church planting in Vancouver, he said, church planting in Seattle is difficult. He said, but church planting in Vancouver is impossible.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, thanks for the encouragement. Like, that's really sweet of you. And, and I think that's the thing, going back to success in ministry and all those kind of things. I mean, we were having to raise support and do all these kind of things with that. And one of the things that David Jett said to me, he said, Jeff, you're going to go to pastors to ask them to support you in church planting, that you have more experience than, that you are probably better qualified to lead their church than they are. And yet now you're humbling yourself and asking them for support to go do something that is completely out of the norm for a Southern Baptist church pastor. Yeah. And we left it all and parachuted in to that city, not really knowing anybody in the city, not really having any friendships. I mean, it was wild.
No, a completely different culture. I mean, we think as Americans, it's Canada, it can't be that different. Oh, it's totally, it's totally different.
Totally different. And the stories of that, man, like you walk in there, and the thing that's crazy is there are people that they literally have no concept of who God is. So a lot of people are like, well, just go there and share the gospel. Yeah, that's what we're trying to do. But you know what we have to do first? We have to back it up and tell them that there's a God. Yeah. And that he exists. Because that's not even in the culture. Church is not in the culture. Like Sunday morning was a time that they could go hike and kayak in the ocean or do something, go to the beach or whatever. But Sunday morning, there wasn't a hint of guilt or, oh, we need to be in church. There was no, that's not even in the culture. And so, like, I remember we were at school and we were meeting different people at the school where our kids went and in downtown Vancouver. And we met this lady, and she came up to me and Sarah, and we were talking to her, just, trying to,
build relationships,
and so she was introducing us to her kids, and her son's name was Noah. And so just to try to do like a quick bridge biblically, I was like, oh, Noah, that name's in the Bible. And she goes, it is?
Wow.
And I'm like, I mean, that's a pretty big story,
Yeah,
right? Noah
yeah.
and the ark,
Yeah.
like that she doesn't even know that story.
Like Hollywood made another movie,
Right.
kind of off of that.
Exactly.
So Charlton Heston. I mean,
yes, like she just had no clue that the name Noah was in the Bible, and so we ended up being able to lead her to Jesus. But the way we did it is we gave her the Jesus Storybook Children's Bible, the Jesus Storybook Bible, and she would call us. She would text Sarah and be like, "Hey, on page 48, I'm reading this story," and it was literally it's a children's Bible. Like they're just going through. I mean, it's a beautiful book and it's amazing, but at the same time, like that's how we figured out how to talk to people about God and Jesus, is to do it through children's Bibles.
Yeah.
Just because that's how biblical illiterate, the whole culture was. I remember the first lady that came to know Jesus in our church, and that's a whole other thing, right? Like, here's the whole story. We were moving there, and Jeff Christopherson, the director of church planning for Canada, we were talking to him, and he said, Jeff, man, I'm so excited you're coming up here. And he said, I just want to tell you, it's going to be 18 months to 2 years of you being here before you see anybody come to know Jesus in Vancouver. And I was like, all right, Jeff, like, you don't know me.
Yeah.
You don't know the amount of students who've come to Jesus. Like, I got this,
Yeah.
I was super arrogant. And God knew that for me going in, how arrogant I was. Because for me, what had happened is in student ministry in the South, I had figured out, in a sad way, how to manufacture salvations. And I don't know that a lot of them were true salvations, honestly. I think, whenever our pastor would come to us and say, hey, Jeff, you're 7 salvations down from this time last year, and so we'd pick up the pace, and I knew I could create a 3-week event and throw a bunch of games and prizes and messy games and a great band, and bring in somebody who can really preach evangelism and preach the gospel, and get all of our students excited about bringing their friends, and they'd bring them all in, and then after 3 weeks we'd be up from where we were last year on salvation, simply because I could orchestrate a service or events to help, and it became very Jeff dependent. And so when God called us to Vancouver, I was very Jeff dependent. And so getting there, when Jeff Christopherson told us that, I was like, man, you don't know us. It's 18 months to 2 years. No, somebody will come to know Jesus in the first 6 months. You know? And a year into it, nobody was even interested in talking to us about God, much less
about the
them,
gospel.
Coming to know Jesus. And so I went into that mode. So a year in, I went into this mode, and I was like, okay, we've got to do something, and I know how to do it. I need to create an event. And so about a year in was Easter coming up, and so I was like, this is what we're gonna do. So we rented out this studio. It was a really awesome building, and really cool. It was in a great part of downtown. We asked one of our partners to give us money so that we could do flyers to all the buildings. So we did 25,000 flyers to all the buildings around us, and we had flyers ourselves, and we were passing out, over 500 of those flyers to different people, inviting all this. So in essence, over 25,000 people were invited to our Easter service.
Which, again, in the South,
right,
even lost, far from God people who could care less about church, if they're ever going to go to church, they may go on Easter.
Right.
Which is, again, hey, that's not a bad thing. We can, hey, invite them and pray that they genuinely get to come and hear the gospel. So that doesn't sound too far-fetched of an idea to do, and not even really a bad thing to do in the area.
Right. Yeah. So we did that, and then and we made these name badges because we had some people that moved up from the South to be on our team, and so they were all kids ministry volunteers, and I was able to kind of scrounge together a few people that I'd already kind of met in the city to kind of be in a band, and we had a worship band, and I remember renting sound, and I rent lights, and I rented a screen and a projector, and we had all these awesome things ready to line up, and we had it all ready to go, and I just was like, all right, here it is. was, and I remember like we had sound check, and I remember, just praying with the team, and then going out into the lobby of this venue and just standing at the door and just thinking, man, just people are just going to start coming in because we've invited them. We've done our part. We've tried to be faithful. And we had one family of 4 people walk through the door, and we had seats for 200.
Wow.
And it was the hardest day I've ever had in ministry. I've been in ministry now 30 years, and it was the hardest, maybe worst day I've ever had in ministry. And there was no need for children's workers because that family didn't have kids, little kids. And it was just our little team and those 4 people in a room that sat probably 300, where we had 200 seats, and it was lonely. It was discouraging. But I tell you what God did. He said, "Are you done? Are you done trying to do this your way? Are you done trying to do this in your own strength, with your own ideas? Because I want you to plant a church here, but I don't want you to do it Jeff's way. I want you to do it my way." And I was like, okay, God, yeah, this is the worst day of my life, and I've created this. By me trying to take control, trying to be my own boss of this church plant, I've created this. And God said, leave it to me, surrender. And the text that he sent me to, what was in Matthew, when Jesus is talking about the parable of the sower, the parable of the seeds and the sower. He's talking about the parable of the seeds and how they fall, on the ground, the hard ground and thorny and bedrock and fertile. But then there's this little passage in between that when he says it and when he explains it. And this little passage in between says, the disciple's like, why do you teach in parables? And he's like, well, and he quotes, he's like, so I teach that because the people of Israel are deaf, and their hearts are hardened, and they're blind. And God just showed me in that text. He said, that's Vancouver. Like, the people are blind. They're to the gospel. They're deaf to the gospel, and their hearts are hardened. And so we had some mission teams coming in that summer, and what we did is I read that passage, and I just said, I want a prayer walk. We prayer walked. Each mission team prayer walked 3 to 4 days while they were there. I'm sure they got so tired of doing that, but I just told them, we've got a prayer walk over this city, and I want you to pray that God would heal them so they can hear the gospel, so they can see the gospel, and soften their hearts. And that's what we prayed for all summer, every mission team. I'll never forget, about 6 months after that, a lady named Sue, the first person who came to know Jesus, came, and she said, we had known her from day one. I'd asked her in that moment, I said, Sue, what does your husband think about this? And, because we had been talking to her, but not him. I said, what does he think about church and about God? And she goes, I don't know. I was like, how long have you guys been married? She said, 25 years. I said, so in 25 years, the subject of the church, God, Jesus, none of that's ever come up. You never even thought about talking about that? She's like, no, never came up. I was like,
yeah. Which when we think about lostness, when we think about missions, putting your yes on the table, people who've 25 years never even crossed their mind to think about God or the church. We think about some distant, dark jungle people, that's never been discovered. We think about primarily Muslim context, dominated countries. We don't think about some of these. This is Vancouver. This is in a democratic society. This is in North America. This is a major city, one of the most affluent, beautiful places in the world. And you're sharing the gospel, do an Easter service, 25,000 people, nobody even thinks to come. One family, the first person you do get to see come to know Christ. Their 25 years of marriage, never even the discussion of God has never even come up. And so, one of the things that I think that's so beautiful about y'all's story, Jeff, and I want to transition here in a moment to, the Lord bringing you kind of from Vancouver to where you guys are now in Las Vegas. So, again, to go from y'all are seeing the Lord move and do great things in Las Vegas. For people in Alabama, a lot of people think, well, boy, that's the mission field, and that's far from like that feels culturally so much lighter and softer ground to work in than what Vancouver was, and it's in Las Vegas. But when we think about church planting, when we think about the Great Commission, the need, I think it's good for our people to hear, especially if you live in the Bible Belt, if you live in the South, that there are places in America. There are places in major metropolitan cities that are so secular, so far from God, so distant from the gospel that it's hard ground to toil. It is hard ground to break up. And but praise the Lord, you guys were willing to go, and you're willing to put your yes on the table. And we need more people to do that, but I think it's good to know so we can pray for those people and so people have good expectations. Hey, when we send people to go be missionaries, church planters in communities like this, we're not sending them to go up there and do an Easter service and everybody's going to show up. We're sending them to go begin a work.
And that's the thing, like at the peak, and we were there 6 years, at the peak of our ministry in Vancouver, we had 30 people. And you just end up feeling like a failure.
Which some of that is just a lot of that, I would say all of that is in the eyes of God. That's never a failure.
Right.
But some of that is, hey, well, we see churches, if we don't have 500,000-600,000 people, then man, that's not a thriving work. Where a church of 30 people is a supernatural work of God. And it probably looked a lot like the New Testament churches. When they're starting new ground, when the church that started at the Philippian church that met in Lydia's house. That is the way the gospel begins. That is the way that the church really begins to thrive. And so I think that's so good, man, for our people to hear that success in ministry is not big gatherings, and that's fine. We pray for that here, but we've got, Enon Baptist Church is 150 years old. So there's decades of generations toiling in the ground, harvesting in the fields, working and moving. But when you go to a place that's new to the gospel, hey, you're for sometimes some situations you're the first people in 100 years, 100 or ever, to really work in that ground.
We had to change the scorecard.
Yes,
the scorecard where I'd ever been in the South was salvations, baptisms, and budget, like giving. So let's get as many people saved, let's get them baptized, and let's teach them how to tithe, because that will help you be a self-sustaining church.
So that you can reach more people, send more missionaries and all that.
We had to change the scorecard, because if you have that same scorecard in an area like the Pacific Northwest, whether it's Portland, Seattle, or Vancouver, or even in the Northeast these days in New York and Boston and Montreal and up in there, like, even in Denver, anywhere in the West, like if you have the scorecard of salvations and baptisms, you'll feel like a failure. You had to change the scorecard. And so salvations and baptisms were still on the scorecard. They were just lower on the scorecard. The top of the scorecard was talk to somebody who doesn't know God. And then after you talk to them, the next thing on the scorecard, really successful, exchange numbers. That's a big deal. And then have a repeat conversation, like set up another time. These are all things we would put on our little scorecards with our team to be like, these are the wins. The wins aren't salvations. Yes, it's on there. But it takes years to get over that, and to get through to people with the gospel. And so that was the biggest thing for us, was we have to change the scorecard. And the other thing was God, he stripped me bare and removed arrogance and humbled me greatly in all of it, and that was super hard. But really, he also taught me that that success doesn't equal even a self-sustaining church. Success is just faithfulness.
Sharing the gospel.
Just being faithful to the call. you know, and that we were up there for those 6 years and we were faithful to the call. And there are still times I look back and I was like, man, that was a rough time. And we failed. We didn't start a self-sustaining church. You know, we got it off the ground, but it didn't survive. And you just feel like a failure, you know. And I remember talking to a couple of partners and just saying, you know, I just feel like we're a bad investment for you. There's not a lot of return for you guys partnering with us financially. Just not a lot of return. And they were gracious and understood how hard the work was. But it did the whole time though. It's like you just feel like a bad investment.
Yeah.
And
which
we were just
again,
tired.
on the flip, yeah. And I would say,
you know?
you and I think it's good even now, man, to speak into your soul and to anybody else who's in those situations. You know, one day you will stand before the Lord and say, you know what, Lord, we gave 6 years of our life of prayer, that those prayers are never lost.
Yeah.
That area, the spiritual warfare that you guys did, if y'all had went up there and did nothing but pray for 6 years, it wouldn't have been a lost investment.
Right.
All the gospel seeds that you sown, Jesus will receive glory from that, did receive glory from that. And so, again, I think success, like you said, is faithfulness. Jesus talked about in the parable about or speaking about the sending laborers into the harvest, he talked about some cities you go to and you share the gospel and they won't receive you and move on, you know, but we're still called to go to these places. Yeah. There were cities where the Apostle Paul went that you couldn't say it was successful. Lystra, when he got to Lystra, they stoned him and drug him out of the city like he was dead. You know, that's not everybody else's successful ministry story.
Right.
You know, how was your ministry? Well, I got stoned. You know, we had a real good ministry experience there, you know, but before the Lord, he was faithful. Right. What I would say, I want two things kind of thinking about the future for our people, and then I want you to briefly wrap up, just give us a few minutes about how God has restored y'all, what he's doing there at Hope Henderson. But when I think about your story and I think about the future of the gospel in these areas, probably one of the things that I would encourage people to pray about, you say, I'm not a pastor, I'm not a church planner, I just love Jesus and I want to live my life on mission for the gospel, is to consider, like it was in the westward expansion in America, when the only people who had gone out west were honestly the outlaws and most of the cities.
People looking for gold.
Yes, absolutely. But then when people started feeling the call to go bring the gospel to these people, churches, a lot of these people were not pastors. Right. You know, they were settlers, they were farmers, and they would just move in an area and say, we're just going to live our life and love Jesus and tell people about him. And then from there, they'd start gathering Christians in their home. And it would eventually grow into a church. And so if you're listening to this, you're like, man, I want to be a part of a movement like that. Maybe your first step would say, pray the Lord maybe calls you to just take your family, move to one of these major cities, and just go there and love Jesus and just pray, God, whatever our next step is. And we can even help, you know, you're familiar with this and have had a lot of connections with the North American Mission Board. You know, because we're Southern Baptist Church, we're able to support the Send cities, which is where our North American Mission Board dollars are helping church planners in these communities. And, you know, if you're retired, you're like, hey, we've got the summer. We don't really have anything to do this summer. You could go to a Seattle or somewhere and just go help and encourage a church planner for the summer. You know, there's so many ways people can live on mission.
That's the thing I appreciate about Kevin Ezell as the president of North American Mission Board, and then Vance Pittman, who was the pastor at Hope Church in Las Vegas, but now is the leader of the Send Network. What I appreciate about those guys is Kevin, when he came to North American Mission Board, he realized that an overwhelming majority of the money was staying in the Southeast that Southern Baptists were giving. We're staying in the Southeast, which is already pretty much a church culture. Yeah. But then we had the West and the Northeast that had nobody doing anything, and even places like Detroit and all those in the Midwest. And so he decided, we're going to flip this. We're going to send a lot of the North American Mission Board, Annie Armstrong money to these cities to do everything we can to take the gospel to these cities where the gospel's not. and even all throughout Canada. And so that has been incredible to see what God's done with that. But there's 3 different ways, if you're listening, that you can get involved. We say prayer, sender, goer. And prayers are people who are just praying. Maybe God gives you Las Vegas or Los Angeles or Seattle or Portland or Vancouver and gives you a city that you just begin to pray for.
Yeah.
And do research. You can get on the North American Mission Board site. You can talk to that. We have every one of the send cities has a send city missionary. You can talk to one of those guys and say, hey, give me a list of the church planners. How can I pray for them?
Yeah, I contacted one of our high school kids who feels called to ministry.
Yeah.
Is talking about spending a summer at one of the send cities there, and he was just able to go to the NAM website, NAMB.net, I think is what it is, North American Mission Board, and you can get all that information and just go to town, just search and click and check it out. Let God stir your heart.
Absolutely. So you can be a prayer, you can be a sender, you can be a goer, and the sender. God taught me something through a man in Memphis. He was in our church, and he's very wealthy. He was very computer minded. He sent his first email. He worked for IBM and sent his first email in 1983 to Australia before anybody even knew email existed or even knew the word. Electronic mail, right? And then he built he helped computer design the flight simulators for FedEx and all this kind of stuff. Earned a lot of money, and then built a company of software, and I mean, he's just incredibly wealthy. You wouldn't know it though when you saw him.
Yeah.
And he was in our church, and he was one of I had his kids in our student ministry. He's one of our leaders in our student ministry, and I remember him coming up to me, and he was in our church in Memphis and said, I'd announced we were going to Vancouver, and he said, Jeff, he said, I know you're going to Vancouver, and it's going to be about a year. He said, how much, you said, but you're going to go on some preview trips. How much do you think those preview trips when you go up to Vancouver are going to cost in total? So I'm trying to do 3 or 4 trips up there just to kind of scout out the area and see where we're going to live and all that kind of stuff. And I said, roughly probably $8,000 or $10,000 probably. And he said, okay. And he said, excuse me for a minute. And he walked away, and I saw him talking to his wife, and he came back and he said, I just want to let you know, we got that. And I said, you got what? He said, the $10,000. He said, I'm going to pay for all that on those trips. And I was like, no. I'm not going to, Ed, you're my friend. I'm not going to do that. I don't want to. And he was like, Jeff, don't do this. And I said, don't do what? I don't want to take your money. This is crazy. And he said, Jeff, don't do this. And I said, what are you talking about? He said, Jeff, all my life I've wanted to go. I wanted to be a goer. All my life I've wanted to be on the mission field. And for whatever reason, he said, I know now why. He said, but I didn't know for a long time. He said, I don't know if you know this, Jeff. He said, but God's economy is different than any economy on this planet. And he said, and I firmly believe God's blessed me financially not to be a goer. This guy's a millionaire.
Wow.
Not to be a goer, but to be a sender.
Wow.
And he said, for you to say to me that you're not going to allow me to send you, he said, is as absurd for me to hear as it would be for you to hear as a goer, and for me to say you can't go.
Yeah. Wow.
He said, so don't do this. Let me send you. And he gave us a lot of money of his own money for 3 more years after that. Yeah. When we were living in Vancouver, simply because he desired to be a sender.
Wow.
And he taught me something about God's economy that day, that senders are everywhere. Yeah. And so if you're listening, you may be a sender. Yeah. God may have blessed you financially with your own company, and you may have a desire to go, you may not have a desire to go, but God's blessed you. And how can you send missionaries and church planters, not just to the West or the Northeast or Canada, but all around the world? How can you be a part of financially? Because God's economy, God's blessed you financially to help you be a sender. Yeah. So what does that look like?
That's good.
Prayers, senders, and goers. And the goers are like we have people that, they job transfer. Yeah. They came up to Vancouver. He was working randomly in Memphis for Canadian National Railway. Well, they have an office in Canada, right? Yeah. In Vancouver. And so he just transferred his job and moved out there. So those are the kind of things that you can do, and especially in today's culture where there's so many jobs where you can work from home
remotely
and live anywhere. Like that this is the time to think about being a goer and going to something. Because like if you stay in the United States, you don't even have to get a work visa.
Yeah.
I mean, you're literally just going into another city and just working remotely. So you can be a goer by moving your family and being a part of a church plant, being a part of a church plant team, those kind of things. So it's huge. Great.
Well, buddy, we're out of time.
Yep.
Give us the 60 second. So the Lord brings you guys from Vancouver. Y'all go to Las Vegas.
Yeah.
The Lord gives you some seasons to heal. Mm-hmm. And then there's a church in Henderson, if I remember this story right, that was basically dying.
Yeah.
And they just needed somebody to come in and preach for a little bit.
Right.
So you're at the main Hope Church in Las Vegas. You come in and start preaching. Then the Lord kind of gives you a heart for these people. And then y'all make it a campus of Hope Church, Hope Church Henderson.
Yeah.
So the church went from being, if I remember right, like 100 people were still gathering. So where are y'all at now as far as reaching people?
Yeah, so we went in about 175 people. Walked into that church hurting. Their previous pastor had a moral failure, and so they were just hurting. And we were able to just kind of go in, love on them, and through the blessings of Hope Church in Las Vegas, we started Hope Church Henderson. And it's just been flourishing ever since. We're running over 600 people now, and just trying to reach the community for the Lord, and partner with schools and just be a light in our community, and God's really just kind of taking us to say, hey, all the hard stuff you did in Vancouver, thank you for doing that. Almost like it's like, okay, God, we surrendered that to you. And God saying, he said, and I remember Jeff Christopherson telling me this about 3 years in. He said, Jeff, I believe what you're going through right now in Vancouver is not for Vancouver. It's for something else. And so I think that, when we moved to Henderson, and God has now started to grow us in Henderson and to see, people coming to know Jesus and people experiencing who God is and what he's doing, I think has just been, God used Vancouver, used the hard times in ministry, used the times where we were stripped bare. It taught us so much about himself, about his faithfulness, about his work, about being dependent on him. One of the things my wife said, she said, we didn't pray enough in Vancouver.
Yeah.
And so we've made prayer a massive part of, we're Tuesday night's election night for us, and we're going to do a big prayer night. Like we do it first Tuesday every month, and first Tuesday of November is election night. And
it's kind of a big deal to pray.
Yeah, let's just do it. So it's first Tuesday of the month, so we're going to do it anyway. So let's just do it. So we feel like that's going to be a huge night for us, just to get together with our church and just pray for our country. And so all those kind of things, man, prayer is the work. Yeah. Then God works. Yeah. And so used to, it was like, we pray before we work. Yeah. And then we go work, right? Okay, God bless this. Right? Yeah. No, prayer's the work. Yeah. Prayer's the work. We gotta put everything in on prayer. Yeah. And then God works.
I love it, man. Yeah. Well, buddy, hey, love you, love your family. Again, when I sit in front of you, man, I think about a guy who has put his yes on the table. He's got some scars, got some stories. But you know what? When we stand before the Lord one day, we were talking about this at breakfast today about foster care, missions, these things. When we stand before the King of Kings who gave everything for us, the things that we will never regret are doing the hard things for him. And that'll be the things that matter the most. Yeah. So, guys, thank you for being here. Thank you for joining us for Porch Talk, and I hope you connect with us again the next episode. God bless.